Okay, we are finishing up the book of Numbers in this week's reading. This is week 11 of the 5-day Bible reading plan. You can find that at 5daybiblereading.com. And maybe you've been working through this from the beginning and you've made it this far. And I can tell you that we are almost what you might say out of the woods in terms of some of the most difficult readings of the Old Testament in one way of thinking, through the laws and the genealogies and census of Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers, and moving toward things that might be in some ways easier to read as we get towards the historical books. But that's not to say that there's not difficult sections ahead, and it's not to say that there aren't valuable things within this section of the Bible. In fact, if you've made it up to this point, then I will commend you, because these are really important sections of the Bible that we do ourselves a disservice if we avoid them in some way or don't appreciate what's going on in them. Okay, speaking of, and by the way, you may be picking up here and not having read up to this point, and that's good too. These are not meant, again, to be simply, I checked every box in 2020. If you're picking up right now and you want to start with, the beginning of Deuteronomy, and you commit yourself to reading the Bible regularly, reading it on a daily basis, that's what this is for. And so, even if you're jumping in the middle, that's good, and I commend you for that, and would just encourage you to make Bible reading a daily habit of yours. Okay, so the book of Numbers, it is famous for that very thing, for having a census recorded where you read about how many people there are in each tribe. And again, that can be difficult to wade through, but we made reference last week to the fact that that census is actually a very helpful key in understanding the themes and the bigger message of the book of Numbers. We said, I think, that there are actually two censuses in this book. So chapter 1 starts out with the people of Israel at Mount Sinai getting ready to leave. They'd been there for over a year, receiving the law. You read about that in Exodus and Leviticus. Now they're getting ready to leave Mount Sinai and head toward the promised land. And so they are counted in chapter 1. Well, we are picking up this week in chapter 26 of Numbers, and we have another counting. Why in the world is there another counting? Well, if you remember, between chapters 1 and 26 comes chapter 13, where we read that because of the faithlessness of the people, a whole generation is laid low in the wilderness. And that really is kind of a summary, or what characterizes everything between Numbers 1 and Numbers 26. We saw the people rebelling against God in various ways, complaining about the provisions God had given to them, missing the things in Egypt, bizarrely enough, on several occasions, complaining about the authority structure, rebelling against authority and saying, why don't we have more power in some way? Okay? Fearing and being doubtful of God's power to give them victory over the people of the land. That's the big one in Numbers 13. But all these instances, sexual immorality, we see later on in chapter 25, fornicating and being involved in idol worship. All of these instances, one after another, this is the cycle of Numbers 1 to 25. Okay, rebellion and death. And then usually some kind of mercy that is shown to them, but bunch of people dying in different ways. Earth's opening up and swallowing people. Serpents are going out and biting people. Plague through the camp. Phineas going around and jabbing people through with a spear while they're engaged in immorality. Rebellion and death. That's the previous generation. And as was declared by God, they would wander for 40 years and they would all die without making it into the promised land. In chapter 26, The census is significant because this is now the counting of the next generation, the new generation. And so the question really becomes, what will become of that generation? Will they repeat the sins of their forefathers, or will they remain faithful to God and enter into the promised land under his protection? The book of Numbers, the rest of it, what we're reading this week from 26 or 27 after the census to 36, is a more hopeful picture. We have, for a few chapters, some laws and some instructions about living in the promised land, about how land will be inherited, about the feast days and these rhythms of worship and sacrifice and remembrance on the calendar. Every day there would be offerings. Every week there would be a Sabbath. Every year there would be the Day of Atonement and other opportunities, first fruits of the harvest to worship, to bring their offerings to God, and then to also to atone for sin. So these laws and instructions are looking forward, again, in a hopeful sense, to when these people will be dwelling in the promised land. Chapter 31 and 32, there is a story of conquest of enemies leading up to the promised land. God gives them victory over those people. As an interesting side note, notice there in chapter 31 that Balaam, who tried to prophesy curses against Israel at the command of Balak, but was unable to, he's actually killed in that battle. And we're given the detail that immorality that the Israelites were engaged in chapter 25 was actually the suggestion of Balaam. So it's as if Balaam couldn't curse the Israelites, and so he, finds another way to harm them, which is by tempting them with idolatry and sexual immorality. But then as we're getting closer in the last chapters of the book of Numbers, and they're conquering these people leading up, some of the land is actually already parceled out and started to be settled in. Reuben, Gad, and a half tribe of Manasseh will actually say, hey, we like the land on the east side of the Jordan. Will you let us just set up shop here? And Moses says, well, yes, but you need to make sure that you come with everybody else over the Jordan and fight with them, and then we will give this land to you. Okay, and then we see the borders of the land being established, cities for the Levites, including the cities of refuge, established, and then ending with some final inheritance laws about how the land will stay within the tribe. Okay, so all of that kind of detail and that some of that may even fall into the category of being difficult to read. But again, think about how this is all instruction for the new generation of Israelites and how it has a hopeful picture of, okay, the sins of the previous generation are behind us. They have been dealt with, and now we are looking forward to life in the promised land. And again, there's this question of how will they proceed? Will they proceed in faithfulness or in unfaithfulness? And that is actually, I think, the perfect segue into the book of Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy being the last of the 5 books of Moses. And now in the book of Deuteronomy, we are really on the doorstep where Numbers leaves us, on the doorstep of the promised land. And Moses is giving one final word, or maybe a collection of speeches, to the Israelites. You may know that word Deuteronomy is Greek for a second law or a second giving of the law. And that kind of tells us what this is all about. In one sense, the law has to be repeated or reiterated because this is a new generation that were young or not even born at Mount Sinai 40 years previously. But in another sense, this is a explanation and an exhortation of the law to prepare the people because they're about to proceed into the promised land. Actually, the first paragraph of chapter 1 says that Moses set out to explain the law. I don't think in so much explaining the technical aspects of the law, but really more so using the law to exhort the people to keep it and to stay faithful to God. And we'll talk more about maybe some bigger structural pieces or themes of Deuteronomy next week when we're setting that whole week aside to read in the book of Deuteronomy. But for now, notice how Deuteronomy is an exhortation. It is a persuasion. It is Moses pleading with the people to be faithful to God when they enter into the promised land. Remember, he's not going in with them. And he mentions that several times in these early chapters. But notice how he is urging them to faithfulness. He does that by reminding them of what God has already done for them and leading them through the wilderness and conquering the people and taking care of them and dealing with sin, but also showing mercy. So he reminds them of the history leading up to this point, and then turns and says, you need to not lose sight of this and to not not commit the sins of your fathers, but instead commit yourself to faithfulness. And in some ways, it's fitting that this week's reading ends with another giving of the Ten Commandments. It begins with another counting of the people, marking that new generation, and it ends with the second giving of the Ten Commandments, because again, the people are being pushed back to the covenant that God made with them at Sinai and saying, this is your chance now to hold to the covenant that your fathers broke. And the basis of the covenant is the same, the Ten Commandments. Love God, love your neighbor, and in doing that and in obeying his commandments, they will be this holy and special people that will stand out in the world, that will bring glory to God. And through that, they will live prosperous and stable lives in the land that God had promised to them and to Abraham, Isaac, and to Jacob. And so that is kind of how we fit the end of Numbers, the beginning of Deuteronomy together. All right, that's it for this week. So thank you.